Hey guys, it's time for the Doctrine talk for the week. This week it's over suffering. And I know that I'm not alone in the fact that I've questioned why. Why am I having to go through this hardship, this suffering? Why must I struggle? What have I done to deserve this? And why does it hurt so bad? Suffering is the experience of physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual pain and or distress. Suffering entered the world as a consequence of the fall of Adam and Eve and will be eternally abolished in the new heaven and new earth. But until then, suffering is inevitable for all people. Suffering may come directly from God, Satan, or our own sinful choices, or as a natural consequence of living in a broken world with natural disasters. We have decaying physical bodies, or even in interactions with other fallen people. Sin can result in suffering for an individual or nation, either through God's direct judgment or punishment, or as a natural consequence of sin. However, not all suffering is the direct result of sin. Some possible reasons for suffering include loving discipline, purification, and or increased intimacy with Jesus Christ, while other reasons for suffering may remain just mysteriously hidden. Regardless of the type, purpose, or reason of the suffering, no suffering is outside of God's sovereign rule. Rather, God is able to use it all for good. Although the Bible does not give a complete explanation for suffering, the fact that God allows suffering cannot mean God does not love us. His love is clearly demonstrated by sending his Son for our salvation. The Lord Jesus Christ is the suffering servant who bore our sorrows, sins, and God's wrath on the cross. By his wounds we are healed. God has promised the suffering of his people will eventually end. And we can read that in Revelations 21:4. But until then, believers should expect to share in the suffering of Jesus Christ as a result of taking up their cross and following him in a hostile world. We saw suffering this week in our lesson. After being sold into slavery by his own brothers, Joseph was indicted on false charges and then thrown into prison. God's preparation of Joseph involved his suffering. God orchestrates every event in our lives, including suffering, temptation, and sin, for our own benefits. We may never know the specific reason for our suffering, but we can trust in our sovereign God. When I do not believe, I question the goodness and wisdom of God in times of suffering. But when I believe that God is sovereign in my suffering, I know that no matter what I'm experiencing or how long it lasts, God is with me. He is working all things together for good, and he will be with me until the end. So how do we apply suffering as leaders? The first thing, God uses suffering and the crucibles of life to build strong character and draw us closer to him. Suffering causes us to lean on, trust, and surrender to God in ways we've never had to before. Suffering puts us in a position where our neediness is exposed. Suffering can lead us to depend on God. So, what temptation, struggle, or hardship are you enduring? What are you learning about yourself? And what are you learning about your relationship with God? And while there is no getting around suffering in this life, God can use it for our good and his glory. The second thing we can apply, God is sovereign in our suffering. The supremacy of God anchors suffering souls. It is our assurance and confidence that not a hair on our heads can be touched without his permission. So what, why me's, or what if onlys make peace unattainable in times of suffering and sorrow? What does this reveal about your belief or acceptance in the divine sovereignty of God? God is sovereign, and he can be trusted to be sufficient in our suffering. Y'all have a good week.